Some commentators root the start of the path towards the Brexit referendum way back to Britain's withdrawal of the exchange rate mechanism, a totemic event that took place in September 1992. It certainly played its part, but I would go even further back than that, at least a few months back, to June 1992. The event that took place that month was a referendum in Denmark on the Maastricht Treaty. And the voters of Denmark, this pro-European country supposedly, voted against the treaty. The reason why that was significant is this. The Monday after the result was announced, I think the result was announced on a Sunday in June 1992, I and a fellow then BBC political correspondent had lunch fixed with John Redwood, then a minister in the new Tory government. And my colleague and I sat down in this basement in the restaurant awaiting John Redwood, and he descended the stairs with a verve and euphoria not normally associated with John Redwood's character. He was utterly ebullient. And the reason was that Danish referendum result against the Maastricht Treaty. He argued that it would give Tory backbenchers and people like himself within the government permission to raise questions about the government support for that treaty. Now, this was extraordinary. John Redwood was a member of a government supposedly supporting the Maastricht Treaty. But there he was, excited, and right to be excited, because there's no doubt that referendum result kind of gave permission, as he put it then, to Tory MPs to contemplate becoming more rebellious over Maastricht. And the context is important because at that point in time, the summer of 1992, John Major, the Tory Prime Minister, was at his most authoritative. He had just won an election in April 92, which many had expected him to lose. It was one of those genuine electoral triumphs, the fourth successive win for the Conservative Party, and his first. He had been an incoming Prime Minister without winning an election, and he had won one, something that Gordon Brown, for example, ached to do, but didn't. So Major was a commanding presence, fleetingly, in British politics and in his party. But that referendum gave Tory MPs permission to contemplate wrecking the Maastricht Treaty. Now, John Major had already negotiated opt-outs to that treaty, opting out of the single currency, opting out of the social chapter. It didn't matter. MPs were getting ready to make his life hellish. Then the pound fell out of the exchange rate mechanism in September. And I think it was the combination of the two that changed the Conservative Party. And a vivid illustration of that change was at that year's Conservative Party conference. It was an entirely different kind of gathering to the ones that political journalists got used to attending. It was fervent, angry. You had people like former senior cabinet ministers Norman Tebbit speaking from the conference floor, condemning the leadership, with the leadership sitting behind him. The fringe meetings, in their anger and ideological verve, all about Europe, were closer to those of the Labour parties in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The Tory party was becoming, in front of our eyes, ideological over Europe. And of course, it continued along that path right up to the Brexit referendum and beyond. There were key staging posts. In 1997, during the election, John Major, the outgoing Prime Minister, had to use an election press conference to plead with his party not to, as he put it, bind my hands in relation to a forthcoming EU summit. Extraordinary for a Tory leader who should be out campaigning for votes to use a press conference to plead with his party. They were slaughtered in that election, largely because of their divisions over Europe. And in the opposition years, Europe again framed what they were all doing. To take one example of many, opinion polls suggested that the most popular figure in their party was the former Chancellor Ken Clarke. And he stood for every single leadership contest, and there were plenty of leadership contests in those years, and he lost every time. And he lost because of Europe. He was the pro-European, seeking to lead an increasingly Eurosceptic party, and a party willing to be defined by its Euroscepticism. And so we had one leader after another, William Hague, who was Margaret Thatcher's choice when she intervened in that election. We then had Ian Duncan Smith, who easily defeated the likes of Ken Clarke and others. Then we had Michael Howard. And finally, David Cameron, who famously portrayed himself as a modernising leader. The context was this: the Conservatives had lost again in 2005. That was their third successive election defeat. And in the lengthy leadership contest that followed, Cameron portrayed himself as the Blair-like figure who would take his party to the promised land by changing it. And Cameron outlined some of the changes he envisaged during that leadership contest. But crucially, he didn't really challenge his party over the issue that had tormented it, Europe. He challenged it on social liberalism, some economic matters, all very important, but it was Europe that had torn his party apart. And all he said was this: we should stop banging on about Europe, which is very different from saying we need to change our approach to Europe. Crucially, too, he felt the need to appease his Eurosceptic wing. He promised that if he became leader, the centre-right MEP grouping of Tory MPs would leave the centre-right grouping, the EPP of the European Parliament, to Angela Merkel's fury. She never really forgave him for that, although they started to get on quite well. So he began his leadership as a moderniser without addressing the issue that had torn his party apart. Interestingly, his opponent then, David Davis, who became Brexit secretary and who argued for out in the referendum, didn't go as far as to say Tory MPs should leave that European centre-right grouping in the European Parliament. And in the years that followed, David Cameron rarely robustly put the case for Europe. He did what other prime ministers have done, vetoing certain things, walking out of some summits, and rarely framed an argument in favour of the European Union. Certainly not consistently and persistently as, say, Nick Clegg did. During the coalition period, when he was Prime Minister, he made his big call on the referendum. Now, there are many ways of looking at this. The critical assessment would be this, from Cameron's perspective, given that he wanted Britain to remain in the European Union, that the decision to offer a referendum, made finally in January 2013 in a speech to Bloomberg, was shallow, self-interested, short-termism. That Cameron felt he had to keep his Conservative MPs on board and casually threw them this referendum lollipop against the advice of George Osborne and indeed Michael Gove. And there is some evidence to put that case against Cameron. If Cameron had looked at depth into referendums, and he should have known about them. He held more as Prime Minister than any of his predecessors. They rarely solve anything. They are only held because Prime Ministers need to keep a party together or a government together. No Prime Minister has held a referendum because they've discovered a sudden love for forms of direct democracy. And they never work on that basis. Cameron could have looked back to the 1975 referendum on Europe, the one held by Harold Wilson. And Wilson said then that that referendum, I'll do Wilson's voice, would be binding on all future parliaments, his 75 referendum. Famously, of course, it wasn't binding on all future parliaments. We've had one since. But it wasn't even binding on Wilson's own party for more than a few years. By 1980, the Labour Party was pledged to leave the then common market without another referendum. So it didn't really hold his party together either, Wilson's. The SDP was formed in 1980, all defecting ex-Labour cabinet ministers, partly because of the issue of Europe. Referendums never resolve anything. But Cameron offered one in the hope that it would solve his problems. Of course, famously, they didn't. They made them so much worse. But, by the way, I think in some ways referendums are like, you know, those femme fatales in film noir where the hero is drawn towards a femme fatale and then he gets bashed about as he moves towards them. And referendums are a bit like that. Leaders are drawn to them. Oh, this will sort out my problems. And then the referendum bashes them around the head. So that's the argument that Cameron acted superficially and recklessly and self-interestedly. There is, though, an argument in favour of his decision to call it, which is this. Being a leader of a party in febrile times is deeply challenging. And the greatest fear a party leader has is MPs defecting to other parties. It is deeply undermining of your own party. It gives the impression of a party falling apart. And Cameron had to deal with something he hadn't calculated for. He had become obsessed with copying New Labour, seeking Middle England support, etc., the support of ex-Liberal Democrat voters. He hadn't planned for the rise of UKIP. And UKIP soared during the coalition years. And at the point when Cameron was contemplating his Bloomberg speech, Nigel Farage was brilliantly, cleverly tormenting Cameron, warning that if he didn't offer a referendum, there would be many more defections from the Tory party to UKIP, including MPs. And I think that was the context in which Cameron decided in the end this issue that had brought down Prime Minister after Prime Minister, had torn apart his party many times, threatened to introduce a major schism with UKIP. The only solution to bind it together was this offer of a referendum that he thought he would win. He returned from Bloomberg, where he delivered that speech, to cheers from his Tory MPs. And indeed, if there had been a flood of defections being contemplated, there was no flood. In the end, 2 Tory MPs defected and became UKIP MPs. There was no flood, but here is something highly significant in terms of a sequencing. UKIP's support in the country continued to soar after the referendum pledge. The UKIP support in the European elections was extraordinary. They topped the ballot in terms of votes cast, and that was after the Bloomberg pledge to hold a referendum. So although Cameron stabilised to some extent the mood in his parliamentary party. In the country, there was still an appetite to register opposition to Europe, and UKIP was, in that context, continuing to flourish. An early warning for Cameron that an offer of a referendum does not necessarily solve the problem. There is another important point in this sequence. A myth has formed recently that Cameron only offered that referendum on the assumption that he wouldn't win an overall majority in the 2015 election, that he would form another coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and that he wouldn't hold the referendum on the grounds that the Lib Dems would veto it. This is not true. Cameron had pledged several times that if he became Prime Minister, the referendum would be held. It would be in his first Queen's speech as Prime Minister, and he wouldn't be Prime Minister if he couldn't introduce the referendum. He had given his MPs, in effect, a cast iron guarantee, which he wouldn't have been able to renege on, to hold a referendum. And Nick Clegg would not have been inclined to veto such a proposition. He himself had proposed it on various occasions, or certainly referendum-related issues to do with Europe. So he was doomed, Cameron, to hold this referendum if he became Prime Minister. The fact that he became Prime Minister with an overall majority in relation to the referendum was neither here nor there. All we can say is that if it had been held under a coalition, the consequences of defeat would have been even greater, because if Clegg had still been Deputy Prime Minister, he too would have had to resign with David Cameron. There's no way he could have stayed in with a government taking Britain out of the European Union. But it was Cameron and Cameron alone. And he began his renegotiation with the rest of the EU soon after that general election victory. Like many others, he assumed Britain would vote for the status quo, as they did in the end in Scotland, when he also had held or offered a nerve-shredding referendum on independence to Scotland. But again, he should have learnt the lessons from that one. Referendums are wholly unpredictable. Leaders, by definition, lose control. They've handed the control over to voters and to some extent the media, who mediate on behalf of the voters. In Scotland, he won in the end for status quo, but such was the wild turbulence of British politics and politics across the Western world post the 2008 crash. The victory sealed nothing. Scottish nationalism erupted after the referendum, and its leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, became the dominant figure in Scotland. Brexit turned out even worse for him. The negotiation was exhausting, and he didn't come back with enough in retrospect. But it's worth recalling, given the mountainous Brexit negotiation that will be following, how arduous it was. He would have to go from one country to another country, negotiate with the Polish leader one day, the leader of the Czech Republic the next day, to get clearance for what some of his cabinet found to be a totally inadequate renegotiation, and one I think that he will continue to argue was more substantial than people were willing to recognise. The stakes were really high for Cameron during that renegotiation because of this. Unlike Harold Wilson in 1975, who knew there was nothing he could do to keep his cabinet united on Europe, Cameron had high hopes that key figures like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove would, back in the end, remain after his renegotiation. He came back and found that that had not happened and felt betrayed, less by Boris Johnson, who he never trusted, but certainly by Michael Gove. Michael Gove actually had every justification for fighting for what he believed in, but Cameron felt personally betrayed by a close friend. And the first trauma, I think, for Cameron in what was to have been a traumatic sequence was recognising that he couldn't carry his cabinet. This was early in 2016. He had to allow them to debate in public on opposite sides. Harold Wilson, when he did the same, called it an agreement to differ. Quite clever, because it had the word agreement in when actually they were disagreeing profoundly. And off they went, the cabinet, on different sides. The next mistake, I think, was to assume that Britain, in this post-crash turbulence, as evidenced by what happened in Scotland, would respond to a kind of New Labour Cameroonian campaign, which is one fought by Remain, the key architects being people like George Osborne, Peter Mandelson and others, who had stunning victories in their time, but the times had changed, become more raw and intense. And they fought a campaign with little emotive excitement, and the other side claimed to offer voters the chance to seize control, to get lots of money to pay for hospitals and so on. And it was a more vividly exciting campaign. They've been condemned by some since for lying over things like the money available for the NHS. But the mistake, if it was a mistake, was to offer a referendum. You can't blame them in a campaign for doing everything possible to win it. It's not a public education exercise, a campaign. And one of the problems with a referendum is that they're binary. And the battle begins and slogans are exchanged and little light is shed. The outcome transformed British politics immediately. It is unprecedented for a British Prime Minister who won an unexpected victory in a general election one year to resign humiliated 12 months later. For much of the year in between, the media were hailing Cameron as the dominant figure of his era and George Osborne as the likely successor. Broadcasters too bought the idea that these two were going to be the architects of British politics for many years to come. Neither are even in Parliament anymore. David Cameron writes his memoirs and George Osborne edits a newspaper. Great vocations, but nowhere near as powerful as being Prime Minister and Chancellor. It had an equally traumatic effect on the Labour Party. The shadow cabinet, or most of it, didn't forgive Jeremy Corbyn, blamed him, unfairly in many respects, for the outcome of the referendum, saying he should have fought a more robust campaign. And that triggered another leadership contest, and that had many ironic consequences. The contest strengthened Corbyn's position. He won another landslide the following September, and there was no way these MPs could mount another challenge. So in their attempt to remove him and failing to do so, they made him stronger. But above all, the most profound turning point was that the incoming Prime Minister, Theresa May, faced the biggest challenge of any Prime Minister since the Second World War, navigating the United Kingdom through Brexit. It was a challenge that she wasn't ready for. She couldn't have been. As she wholly truthfully said, she didn't expect to have been in that position. She thought either that Cameron would win the referendum, or she believed him, because before the referendum he said he would stay on if he lost. So for the referendum to be lost and for her to be in number 10 within days after the most bizarre leadership contest that could possibly have been staged must have been wholly daunting. And she addressed the task in two ways. Above all, evidently, she felt, as someone who had argued for Remain, albeit subtly and without a high profile, she had to convince her party that she was deadly serious about leaving. So she made absolutely clear that she was deadly serious about it. She appointed 3 Brexiteers in the key Brexit departments: Boris Johnson at the Foreign Office, David Davis in a new Brexit department, and Liam Fox responsible for trade. She balanced her cabinet. Philip Hammond was made Chancellor, a Remainer. Amber Rudd, a passionate Remainer, went into the Home Office. Like Harold Wilson, she was leading a divided government over Europe, like John Major actually and Margaret Thatcher. All governments have been divided over Europe. So that's how she partly dealt with it. She felt clearly, to reassure her backbenchers and indeed her party membership, most of whom had voted out, that she needed to make a pretty quick commitment to trigger Article 50. So very early on, she said that Article 50 would be triggered by March of 2017. And she did it. But she did it without fully working out where she wanted to be in terms of Brexit 2 years later, which is the timetable allowed for Article 50. That's out of character for her. She's an assiduous kind of politician, does a lot of homework before forming the policy. But the politics of Europe propels prime ministers to be less cautious than they normally would. And Article 50 was triggered in the semi-darkness by Theresa May. She has insisted throughout that her government would be about much more than Brexit. But Brexit is so complex and so mountainous that it will be a challenge for her to focus on anything else, as David Cameron discovered with his relatively minor renegotiation of Britain's terms. Dominated his time for a few months. And then for Theresa May, there was another decision that she took, which was Brexit related. And that was to hold another general election. She had begun her premiership saying that she wouldn't do it, that she would serve the term, that a general election would be a distraction. But partly because she didn't trust the current Parliament to deliver Brexit on the terms she sought, she succumbed to the temptation to hold an election, which in turn became a seismic turning point. But Brexit was the context. It is the unavoidable context of virtually everything Theresa May and her colleagues say and do. And it is the inevitable context of virtually everything Jeremy Corbyn and his colleagues do. If a Prime Minister holds a referendum and loses, there are bound to be seismic consequences.